The Where Our Minds Wander podcast may contain sensitive content and explicit language. Listener discretion is advised.
Hello and welcome to Where Our Minds Wander, all you fellow wanderers. I'm Wes, and that's my wife and co-host, Beth.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us.
So, Beth, I was thinking that for tonight's episode, we'd just skip the housekeeping and get straight into tonight's stories.
Okay, so we're not going to tell people to go check out our stuff on TeePublic or our premium bonus episodes?
Nope, not tonight.
Okay, that sounds good.
Alrighty, all you wanderers, sit back, get comfy, and let's get into it. So, Beth, what are you talking about tonight?
Well, I feel like we haven't covered a UFO story in a while, so I thought we'd go to Lake Michigan and talk about one.
It has been a while.
People living around Lake Michigan are no strangers to UFOs. People like Cindy Pravda, a Grand Haven resident, who remarked to a friend on the phone one evening, "I've got a UFO in the backyard." Cindy wasn't just witnessing one UFO. She actually saw 4 lights, like full moons, light up her pasture from their position over the trees. Each one was bright and circular with defined edges. In subsequent interviews, Cindy says she watched the lights for half an hour as the one on the far left moved off towards the highway and then flew back to its original position next to the other 3. She says there's no way that they were helicopters because the one on the right was gone, quote, in a blink of an eye. The night in question was March 8th, 1994, and on that night, over 300 people reported seeing a string of strange lights over and around 42 counties in Michigan. The event became known as the Lakeshore incident, otherwise known as the Lake Michigan UFOs. Most witnesses described the UFOs as resembling blue, red, white, and green flickering Christmas lights, outlining 5 or 6 circular or cylindrical objects. Reports flooded in to 911 emergency services, the Muskegon County Airport, the National Weather Service, and even MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network. Daryl and Holly Graves were one couple who called the police. Their son, Joey, was the first one to see the strange lights. He told reporters that he witnessed, quote, 6 lights out the window above the barn across the street from their Holland living room at 9:30 p.m. He said he got up and went to the sofa and looked up at the sky. They were red and white and moving. Holland, by the way, is 22 miles away from Grand Haven. Jeff Velthouse was the officer who arrived at the Graves home in time to see the lights for himself. Using binoculars, he actually got a pretty good look at them. You could actually read a copy of his police report online if you were so inclined. In it, he says he did see an object with red, green, and white lights. He said it didn't appear to be an airplane since the lights were oscillating. He then noticed 2 other objects in the sky. He decided to try and follow them in his patrol car, so he headed southwest. As he was driving, the 911 dispatcher told him that reports were coming in from all over. A fellow officer was interviewing a man named Troy Prince at that exact moment about 3 unidentified lights Prince had also seen, which seemed to come together and move apart. The dispatcher also told him that another officer was on the phone with someone at the National Weather Service, and they were tracking the anomalies too. Still heading southwest, tracking the lights with his own eyes, Officer Velthouse got to the Tulip City Airport, possibly expecting to see an aircraft come in for a landing that would explain it all, but he did not. The lights he had witnessed were gone. He also reported that there was no personnel at the airport to speak to whatsoever. Meanwhile, the police department was on the phone with the local branch of the National Weather Service, speaking to the young man who was tracking the objects. Unbeknownst to him, until the very end of the call, their conversation was recorded, which you can also listen to online if you would like to. In it, the young man said, quote, "Yeah, there's something big down there. That's really strange. It's moving toward the west-southwest. Looks like a big blob. It was up about 6,000 feet or so. It disappears. It's moving." The man went on to note, quote, "I'm getting it now at about 12,000 feet. It's a pretty strong return. Oh my God, what is this? Now I'm getting 3 of them, and they're about separated by about 5,000 feet in height." So, as he was watching one of the objects on the radar, it appeared to be coasting at about 100 miles per hour. Then, in a split second, it rose to 5,000 feet. Then, a split second later, 10,000 feet, straight up. One of the objects rose to 60,000 feet as all 3 continued to move in erratic, not normal ways. When they got to the south end of Lake Michigan, the young man was even more startled to see a dozen more similar objects just blipping away on the radar. The man said, quote, "I've never seen anything like this, not even when I'm doing storms. These aren't storms." Later in his shift, Officer Velthouse decided to follow up with the National Weather Service himself. He spoke to the same young man who had been watching the radar the entire time. For years, the man chose to remain anonymous, fearing that he would lose his job or face incredible skepticism, which, of course, the Weather Service did dish out in the days following the sightings. But I'll get to that in a minute. Officer Velthouse spoke to the man, who has recently come forward as Jack Bouchon. Throughout their conversation, the 2 men tried to come up with rational, ordinary explanations for what they'd both seen. They even questioned whether it was the new lights on a nearby radio tower somehow. But how these 3 lights seemed to be able to travel 20 miles in just 10 seconds was baffling, or jumping straight up by 5,000 feet in the blink of an eye. And it wasn't just that. The radar showed the objects coming together and jumping apart 20 miles at a time. They'd hover, then jump back together. It appeared to Bouchon like they were expanding into a wider and wider triangle every time they jumped back into position. Bouchon even described what the objects looked like on the radar. He said that they appeared as 3 or 4 blips, and they could not have been planes. Planes show up like pinpoints on the scope, and these were the size of half a thumbnail. So they were huge.
But they were.
He mentally ran through all of the technical glitches or weather phenomena he could think of, and none of it fit what he had seen. At one point in his conversation with Officer Velthouse, he asked the officer what he thought it was. Velthouse replied with what witnesses were seeing in the sky: 5 or 6 cylindrical objects moving together with blue, red, white, and green lights. So, I had said earlier that after the initial conversation between Bouchon and Velthouse, the National Weather Service swooped in with an explanation. Officials claimed that it was simply clutter on the radar, that it was nothing more than radar beams bouncing off objects on the ground, echoing back returns. Then, they said it was military aircraft. However, the Air Force liaison to the FAA confirmed that there wasn't any military aircraft in the sky that night anywhere near Holland or Grand Haven. And the thing is, these UFOs were seen across 42 counties as far as the Indiana state line. If you listen to the half hour of 911 calls released online, which I highly recommend because they're very, very interesting, the people calling in sounded anxious yet apologetic. Many of them started off by saying things like, "I don't know if you've gotten any calls about strange lights. Maybe they're military or something. but there's this circle of bright lights. And then they'd go on to say that they weren't like any airplane they'd ever seen before, and that they were heading east or southeast. Or there are other callers who started off by saying things like, this is a non-emergency, but... So you can clearly hear the anxiety in their voices, or dismay, or just complete amazement. One caller said that there were 4 lights in a V shape, bigger than any plane he'd ever seen. Then it went down to 3 lights, seemed to circle around, and then flew up and down before another light disappeared. So it was now down to 2 lights. Then it went down to just 1 light that spun in a circle. It's also interesting to hear the 911 dispatcher's tone change over the course of the calls as well. At first, he's polite and matter-of-fact about sending out an officer, but you can hear the skepticism in his voice. By the 5th or 6th call, though, he's like, "Yeah, you're not the only one."
Well, I'm sure he was just getting pounded with calls. Poor guy probably didn't even have time to take his lunch.
And they really were, because you can even hear calls in the background and like other people answering them, and they're kind of talking to each other as they're in between calls.
Yeah, sometimes 911 really gets pounded.
Yeah. Unfortunately, some of the people who reported the lights experienced some backlash, like the Graves family, who had reached out to the police and then were interviewed by the paper. Their children were bullied at school, and some locals even said ridiculous things like they were doing drugs with their kids.
That's just wrong.
It's really wrong. But like I said, there were 300 witnesses who filed reports, and some of those went directly to MUFON. At one point in 1994, MUFON was receiving 10 to 15 reports a day from the Lake Michigan area. 20 MUFON investigators interviewed dozens of witnesses, and they were able to rule out small planes, blimps, weather balloons, satellites, gas, shooting stars, and military aircraft. So all the usual. So whether it was clutter on the radar or not, which I personally don't believe it was, but let's just say for argument's sake that that is what it was. Is it possible for 300 people to misidentify something in the sky at the exact same time? And those were just the 300 people who actually called someone to report it. There had to be hundreds more.
Oh, at least.
And if it was just a misidentified object, like a plane or balloon, then how come people describe such different shapes, from circles to cylinders to V-shapes? It just doesn't make sense to me. But just as an aside, because I found this really interesting and kind of weird, when I was researching this story, I'd come across a site that had FOIA-released government documents specifically about UFO sightings over Lake Michigan for a span of like 30 or 40 years, including the 1994 Lakeshore incident. And I only skimmed it when I found it. But even skimming it, I could see that it had descriptions of the events and then what the U.S. government determined what each one could have possibly been. And some of them were determined to be identified things, but some were not, including unexplained UFOs. It said right on it, unexplained UFO. So I saved the site, and I planned on coming back to it and really reading it carefully when I had the time. And the very next day, when I went to reopen it, I got this weird screen that said the site no longer existed because the authors deleted it. So I thought, that's freaking weird. So I waited a bit because my laptop is a bit of a dinosaur. She's chugging along still, but sometimes she doesn't always load very fast. So I tried it again, but I got the same message. So the website is just gone.
Right. And I remember you telling me about how it disappeared. So I went and looked on my laptop, and my laptop is super fast. It's not like your dinosaur laptop, which, by the way, you could have used mine, but hey. And it wasn't there.
I know.
It was just gone, which that's never happened to us before. It is kind of odd. I'll give you that. I've never seen that happen.
It was really weird, and I have no clue why it would be like that. And I even checked it on my phone before we recorded tonight, just to see, and it was still the same message.
Well, maybe the men in black paid a visit to whoever posted it.
Yep, and now they're tracking what I Google, which is awesome.
Well, you never know. Maybe they'll show up on our front doorstep. And didn't we watch a good documentary about the Lakeshore incident?
We did, although it was actually an Unsolved Mysteries episode,
okay.
I think, from back in October. And I think, if I'm remembering correctly, it was called Something in the Sky.
I can't remember the episode number, but I believe it was called Something in the Sky. I just remember watching it in awe because the gentleman from the National Weather Service was just so credible. Over the years, he had just compiled so much evidence of what happened. It was just unbelievable.
It really was. And he stayed quiet for so long because he seriously was worried about losing his job.
Well, yeah, I would be too. Well, that was really cool. And you should all go check that out because it is an awesome episode if you haven't seen it.
Hey, did you know? Rat kings are a real thing. Groups of rats inexplicably tied together by their tails, which are so tangled together they can't escape each other. Imagine a whole bunch of rats, some dead, some alive, knotted together by their tails, some of them still climbing over the others to just become more and more entangled. It's a creepy thought. Rat kings have been collected and preserved since 1576, but the phenomenon hasn't stopped happening. In 2005, a rat king containing 16 rats, 9 of which were still alive, was discovered in Estonia. The 16 rats' tails were knotted together with frozen sand. Who'da thunk it? So what are you talking about tonight?
Well, we're headed someplace that's strange and warm, so you might want to get your bikini out.
My bikini. I haven't worn a bikini since 1985.
Well, then, I guess we got to go shopping because you're going to need it for this place. On February 14th, 1981, 12-year-old Todd Domboski was playing in his backyard. Suddenly, without warning, the ground beneath his feet opened up, caving into a searing hot sinkhole. Thinking fast, Todd grabbed onto an exposed tree root as smoke filled with lethal amounts of carbon monoxide plumed around him. Todd held onto the tree root until his 14-year-old cousin, Eric Wolfgang, was able to somehow pull him to safety. The depth of the sinkhole went down a terrifying 150 feet.
That's a heck of a Valentine's Day.
For most people, the idea of deadly sinkholes opening up in the yard is not something they think about on a daily basis. It seems more like something from a science fiction disaster movie. But Todd Domboski and his family lived right in the middle of a disaster zone, one that began in 1962 and is expected to continue for another 100 to 250 years. Todd lived in Centralia, Pennsylvania, where the earth has been on fire beneath the residents' feet for over 50 years. The land that is now known as Centralia has had a pretty interesting history. It was purchased by colonists from native people in 1749 for £500. By 1793, Robert Morris, who was a Revolutionary War hero and a signer of the Declaration of Independence, owned about a third of the land. But just 5 years later, he lost the property due to financial woes, and he spent time in debtor's prison. Ownership of the land changed hands again in 1830 when it was purchased by a French sea captain named Stéphane Girard, and the area got its first name, Bull's Head, when Jonathan Faust opened a tavern by the same name. Gerard knew he was sitting on some rich coal deposits, and he sold the area to the Locust Mountain Coal and Iron Company in 1842. One engineer named Alexander Ray had a vision for the area, planning out a village that could expand over time. He renamed the area Centreville, predicting that it would become the region's center of commerce. By 1854, the Mine Run Railroad was built specifically to haul coal from the valley to other places. By 1865, there were at least 5 separate and operational coal mines in the area. Because business was booming and the town was expanding, a post office was put in, except there was already a Centerville in Pennsylvania, prompting them to change their boomtown's name to Centralia.
I can see how that would be confusing.
By 1866, there were 1,300 residents. The Molly Maguires, an Irish-American group fighting for improved wages and working conditions, were pretty active in Pennsylvania at this time. They encouraged miners to form unions and fight for their rights. In October of 1868, Alexander Ray, the founder of Centralia, was murdered. His body was found in his buggy on the road between Centralia and Mount Carmel. 10 years later, 3 members of the Molly Maguires were convicted of his murder and hanged in 1878. Although the Molly Maguires were allegedly responsible for other murders and arson throughout Centralia, there's one legend that I wanted to bring up because it comes into play later. The St. Ignatius Catholic Church was built in 1869, and the first priest to deliver sermons there, Father Daniel Ignatius McDermott, was supposedly assaulted by 3 members of the Molly Maguires that same year. He apparently cursed the land after this, saying there would come a day when all that remained standing in Centralia was the St. Ignatius Roman Catholic Church.
That seems unusual, a priest cursing something.
He sounds a bit bitter. But it wasn't the only church in town. By 1890, there were 7 churches. The population had peaked at 2,761, and Centralia had 5 hotels, 27 saloons, 2 theaters, the post office, a bank, a parochial school, convent, and 14 general stores. Like most American coal mining towns, it didn't last long. As new energy options became popular, the Great Depression arrived, and then World War I took many young men away from home. Centralia suffered just like everywhere else. There was a slight boom in the 1940s with the demands of World War II, but by the 1960s, the town's population had dwindled back down to about 1,300, and all of the former mines were permanently closed. And then came Memorial Day of 1962. The city council had a Memorial Day celebration coming up, and they wanted to clean up the landfill next to the Oddfellows Cemetery. They decided to burn the overabundance of garbage. Volunteer firemen watched the burn extremely carefully, dousing it with water throughout the burn, and then redousing it again after it was deemed out. It went fine until a few days later when spontaneous fires just started igniting in different parts of the town. They were put out, of course, but then others in different areas would just spring up, and more fires continued to keep popping up everywhere. It was weeks later when the horrifying discovery was made. Despite taking all precautions with their landfill, and despite the careful, meticulously watched burn, there was a hole in the landfill wall system, and that hole led directly into the coal fields spanning 3,400 acres beneath the entire town of Centralia.
Oh, no.
The residents were thrown into an immediate, never-ending nightmare. Of course, attempts were made to put the fire out immediately. Water was pumped directly into the mine tunnels, and the surface area was covered in clay. But this didn't actually work. The coal continued to burn, the fire continued to spread, and the high levels of carbon monoxide continued to billow up in clouds of noxious gas from the earth itself. Other attempts were made, but as they each took more resources than originally thought, or they ran into unexpected problems, each effort ran out of funding. For example, one idea was to dig deep trenches to expose the burning coal, but there was so much of it, they just couldn't keep on top of it all. Then they tried extinguishing the fire with crushed rock and water, but the uncommonly cold temps froze the water lines and stone grinding machine. They also worried about running out of crushed stone, so they only filled the mines halfway, which didn't stop the fires. When they exceeded their project budget by $20,000, they had to call it quits. Despite their efforts and $7 million total, the fire actually spread by 700 feet. In 1979, John Coddington, a gas station owner and Centralia's mayor, went to check his fuel tanks. It was simply a routine check of the gas levels in each tank. However, when he removed the dipstick, he thought things seemed a little warmer than they should be. When he checked the temp of the gasoline with a thermometer, it registered 172 degrees. Despite his concerns, the underground fire was downplayed. Perhaps the powers that be didn't truly comprehend the magnitude of what they were really dealing with. Maybe the people of Centralia were way more optimistic than they should have been, or they believed the hype that they were being told. Regardless, in the 1980s, Centralia's population was holding steady at about 1,000 residents. Residents claimed to like growing tomatoes in midwinter and not having to shovel their sidewalks when it snowed. Perhaps these people were the ones the news media and government liked to quote because they didn't know what to do about the terrifying things that were really happening there. The ground itself in some parts of town reached 900 degrees, turning everything to nothing but ash. Trees began dying. Residents began passing out in their homes from carbon monoxide poisoning that seeped into their basements. Homes began tilting on their foundations, and sidewalks and streets buckled. Sinkholes, some smaller than 150 deep, like the one in Todd Domboski's backyard, opened up. Greg Walter wrote an article for People magazine in 1981 that said, quote, "Graves in the town's two cemeteries are believed to have dropped into the abyss of fire that rages below them." End quote.
That's terrifying.
That it is.
Well, I'm just thinking, too, of the ground being 900 degrees and everything dying around them.
It had to be horrible. In the late 1990s, the area behind St. Ignatius Catholic Church was on fire. All grass and other vegetation was scorched to nothing for a quarter mile. Hundreds of fissures and holes dotted the ground, each one billowing steam and smoke that was filled with poisonous gases. Man-made pits that were dug to offer more gas release melted tires and plastic bottles that were littered inside them. Dead trees were bleached white. But the church still stood, at least for a little while longer. And although Father McDermott wasn't exactly right, St. Ignatius wasn't the last building standing in Centralia, but he was close. The church remained until it had to be razed in 1997, but its cemetery is still there. The Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary Ukrainian Catholic Church is the last remaining church in Centralia. When it was proposed that truly putting out the fire would cost Pennsylvania a whopping $606 million, the government decided that it would be more cost-effective to give out $42 million to buy out and relocate almost all of Centralia's residents. Today, Centralia has 9 residents remaining. There are several low, round metal steam vents embedded in the ground throughout the south side of town. There are warning signs about the underground fires, unstable ground, and dangerous levels of carbon monoxide. Smoke still plumes up from the cracks in Route 61. The last remaining house on Locust Avenue was demolished in 2007. The house had gained some public notoriety because of photographs that showed what looked like 5 chimneys from its foundation to its roof. They were actually 5 support beams that had to be installed to keep the home upright after the connected homes on either side were demolished. In 2014, the remaining residents and some former residents decided to open a time capsule that had been buried since 1966. Although they were 2 years early from the original date to open the time capsule, they decided that since someone had tried to dig it up in order to steal it, that they'd do it then. Inside it, Beneath 12 inches of water, they found a miner's helmet, a miner's lamp, some coal, a Bible, local souvenirs, and a pair of bloomers signed by the men of Centralia in 1966.
Well, other than the bloomers, that's pretty ironic in a sad way.
But why would they put bloomers in there in the first place, and whose were they?
I think maybe just to show what the clothing looked like at the time. Maybe. I don't know. People put clothing in them. Not usually bloomers, but...
Yeah, I guess so.
But I'm just saying, the miner's helmet and the lamp and the coal, it's just... There's a lot of irony there.
Huh. Well, when we do ours, maybe we could put your bikini in it.
It has a greater chance of seeing the light of day than it does in my closet.
Right. For a while, tourists were coming to Centralia just to see the burning town for themselves. A closed-down section of Route 61 became known as Graffiti Highway, a place where people spray-painted designs and names. Unfortunately, not everyone stuck to the abandoned stretch of the highway and began tagging churches and cemeteries within town.
Because people are jerks.
That they can be. In April of 2020, the Graffiti Highway was covered over in sand in an attempt to stop the vandalism. Regardless of whether it matters or not how the fire actually started, there is some debate as whether the landfill burn really actually caused it all. Remember that hole that I said was in the landfill wall?
I do.
Some theorists say that the hole in the clay barrier wall was actually ignited the day before when a trash hauler dumped hot ash into the landfill. Still, others say that the landfill had nothing to do with it at all. They cite a previous coal mine fire from 1932, saying it had never actually burned out and had simply reached a higher concentration of coal on that day of May 1962, and that it was just a mere coincidence. One man who said that couldn't possibly be true was former miner Frank Jurgel Sr. He said he and his brother were bootlegging miners between 1960 and 1962 in the exact area where that 1932 fire broke out. He said that if it had still been burning, he and his brother wouldn't have been able to mine where they had because it would have killed them.
Good point.
The fires beneath Centralia will burn for at least another 100 years. Some sources even guess it could be between 100 and 250 years. All in all, it has about an 8-mile stretch of area encompassing 3,700 acres before it will run out of coal. According to a 2020 map published by the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection, Centralia is one of 37 underground coal mine fires currently burning in Pennsylvania.
Holy crap!
Of those 37, 11 are classified as confirmed burning, 4 are presumed burning, and 15 are presumed out. The remaining 7 are under construction or out.
Okay, so my question is, what exactly is the difference between presumed burning and presumed out? It seems like a half glass full, glass half empty way of classifying things. If I lived near one, I'd kind of want to know the actual answer.
Well, I would want to know also. But as we all know with many disasters, it's not always easy to get real answers. But it's certainly a place I'd like to see for myself, preferably at a safe distance above in a helicopter.
Right, and I won't be going anywhere near there in any sort of bathing suit. Thank you very much.
Well, we'll see. You wouldn't even go in your bathing suit in a helicopter? It's still going to be a little toasty up there, I imagine. No.
But in all seriousness, though, it's really sad. And it sounds like, that town just literally died out because of a mistake. And it's going to burn for a very, very long time.
Yeah, it sounds like hell on earth.
It really does.
Well, I guess that about wraps it up for this episode, Beth.
Yeah, I think so. And as always, if you want to know more, you can check out our sources in our show notes for more information about both Centralia and the Lakeshore incident.
That you can. So, We hope you all join us next week for an all-new episode of Where Our Minds Wander.
See you soon. Thank you for joining us. We look forward to traveling with you again to the places where our minds wander.
If you like what you heard, please take a moment and provide us with a 5-star rating and a comment on your favorite listening platform. It really helps us move up the list and become more visible on the podcast charts so new people can find us.
Thank you all for your continued support.
See you all next week for an all-new episode of Where Our Minds Wander.